Thank you, Brianne, Stacy, for covering leadership, management commitment, stakeholder engagement, first two elements in our document. The next two elements are risk management and operational controls, and those will be covered by Linda Doherty and Mark Hareth. We're going to do questions at the end. So sorry if that wasn't clear to people. Because we have so many elements to get through, we're going to wait to the end, so feel free to write them down. You can send them in through the webcast. We'll queue them up and deal with them towards the end. So, ooh, you guys are going to stand there together. This is scary. On the right.
Yeah, you should be afraid, Jeff.
Yeah, I agree.
Linda and I have done tag team presentations before, actually with Stacy, so we're going to stay with our tradition.
The only difference is we don't have mics to run around the audience, but so if we start fidgeting, and you'll understand where that's going. So, first element, risk management. So, there's been a lot of work done on risk management over the years. So what does this RP have? Anything that it can possibly add? Most folks are going to look at risk management and say, well, in regard to a pipeline system, we evaluated, through integrity management or other operational controls, all of our risks. We identified the threats. We know how to manage these assets. Well, the RP actually takes a step back and says, look, it shouldn't just be the assets. It should be the people. It should be the processes. It should be every threat or risk that could impact the operationality of your pipeline, the safety of your pipeline.
And the idea is to take that careful look. And in the document, we took a long, hard look at the concepts of hazard, the concept of threats. We found that hazards were used in a lot of other high-risk industries. And so we've tried to weave the two together because they're both very important. At the end of the day, we believe that threats is a more comprehensive term, that it can encompass the concept of hazard, which is very important, and so we wove that in. The emphasis here again is to look at the pipeline through the full life cycle, so it's beyond just operations and maintenance, but what are the things we can do in design? What are the things that we can do in procurement that help with this process of managing risk, and look at having preventive controls, mitigation, and ongoing monitoring.
There's one other thing I'd like to add is that when you've heard several of the other speakers talk about this idea of safety culture, for me, it boils down to simply doing the right thing at the right time because it's the right thing to do. Not necessarily because it's been ingrained in you to follow a specific procedure, but that you know what that procedure is, and you know what the right thing is to do. And later on, we'll talk about deviations from it. I use a simple example. How many, well, maybe I shouldn't show of hands. How many people here do not use their seatbelts? Okay, well, I can tell you when I grew up, my parents didn't use their seatbelts. Because although people had told them it was the right thing to do, they didn't believe it. It was a law. They didn't believe it. They didn't do it. They hadn't incorporated that safety culture. However, if you look today, almost everybody does use a seatbelt because they've determined that it's the right thing to do. They've assessed the risks, not just because whether they're a good driver or not, there might be a problem with the car or the road or other drivers. They've incorporated their total risk assessment of all the risks. They've determined what their mitigation factors are, using a seatbelt or not texting while driving or making cell phone calls while they're driving. And they've decided to adopt a safety culture approach of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do to promote safety.
And I think as we've noted that this element in the RP builds upon the concepts that we have with risk assessment and risk management that you'll find in the integrity management rules, whether it's distribution integrity or transmission integrity. But we also step back, as you heard Brianne say in the first session, we spent time talking with people in other industries, particularly those high-risk industries, where failure is frankly unacceptable to the public. And we looked and said, what can we learn from them? And one of the cases that we looked at here was an existing standard that exists within ISO 31010, and it had some of the same common elements that we've seen in our programs, but it caused us to step back and take a fresh look. And that's why we looked at hazard, and we looked at threats, and we looked at how can we create a context and a terminology that will help people drive towards doing the right things.
And when you also look at risk, you have to look at data. Not just your data, but you have to look at other people's data. And that involves looking at the experiences. I think Ron had mentioned that wherever Ron had mentioned that the most valuable experience is sometimes from what others go through. The most expensive experience is what you go through. So why can't we benefit from the learnings of others and the experience of others? You know, learn across the board, learn from other industries, learn from other portions of the pipeline industry, harvest that data and determine what it might mean to you. You know, one of the concepts of a high reliability organization is that you always wonder what could go wrong. You know, when you look at the pipeline industry, we have an amazing safety record. We have a few problems. I'm not saying we're there yet. Our goal is 0. And there's been some tragic incidents. But you know, overall, when you look at the trend lines, we look pretty good. We cannot rest on that laurel. We cannot sit back and say, oh, we're there. We're done, right? Are we good? We're done, right? No, we're not done. Because the moment we have that false sense of security, when we think that we are there, is when we let our guard down and when bad things happen. So we must learn and must constantly expect something to go wrong and prepare for it.
I think one of the aspects that we talked about that relates to a comment that Ron made early on is this idea of routine, doing things routine so that they become a part of the way that you're thinking. And we looked at this idea of really specifying that risk assessment be done periodically, that the risk management process be applied that way, and that you're looking at it annually. And you know, some of the pushback we got was, well, wow, do we really need to do it annually? And if your risks and your threats, if your threats aren't changing, your hazards aren't changing, that process of doing it annually will be easy. But it's really having the discipline and the intentionality of looking and saying, have I looked at this really, really carefully? And then making that tie to ensure that top management is aware of the risks. You know, one of the things we saw out of the BP Horizon failure, and we've seen out of other larger failures, is you're seeing risk committees, subcommittees on boards wanting to see more about the risks in a company through risk registers, through looking at risk ranking systems. And this was to help make that tie so that risks were being elevated and revealed up to top management.
Go ahead.
Element 4 is operational controls. And this is an interesting term. This is a place where we drew upon API 750, which is actually the standard that the NTSB actually pointed us to as a starting point. But we found this in other places. And it's the idea of having a collection of concepts or a collection of activities that one undertakes to really provide control in the system. From a financial standpoint, the finance people look at controls as the means to provide how am I going to assure ultimately the safety that I get.
So we know that a lot of other industries have successfully used SMS. You heard Chris Hart talk about the amazing success of the FAA industry. And I bet if you asked them, they'd say, well, we're not there yet. We're continually learning. You know, so this whole idea of lessons learned, we've all heard it a million times. But one of the things that I learned through this process, it's not just about looking at other people's lessons learned and say, okay, yeah, I got that. It's about acting on those lessons learned. So if I learn something new, what am I doing to address that in my organization, in my pipeline company? What am I doing to head off or mitigate the possibility that that tragic event could happen where I am?
You know, the concept of safe work practices was one we found in not only API 750, but we found it as a really core part of OSHA process safety management. And if you and we had operators among our group say, well, we have safe work practices. They're there for personnel safety. And what we learned in our interactions with people from process safety management in the chemical industry and refining industry, other high hazard industries, is that the safe work practices relate to how you conduct work that you're doing in terms of routine maintenance, the way you think about design, the way you design safety in as a part of the process. So safe work practices are a part of this document, as they are in many other industries.
And one of the things that Chris alluded to in his discussion was this whole idea that there may be occasions where you need to deviate from procedures. There might be a situation that one of your frontline workers comes in contact or is supposed to, he knows the procedure say he needs to do A, but he knows that's the unsafe thing to do. How does he deviate from that? The RP suggests that there should be a process by which that individual can throw up a red flag and say, hey, I don't think this is the way to go. And you need to formalize it and make it a non-punishment situation. Make it okay for people to question procedures and suggest alternatives.
And system integrity is a really nice one to make a bit of a segue here. You know, we had many commenters on the first RP that came out as a draft that said, you know, there's elements in here that we find in other places. Why do you have them in here? Why is this duplicative? And this is a classic case of that, because we talk about design, we talk about specification, we talk about the need to have the presence all the way through, as we put in this slide here, the pipeline life cycle. And what this RP does is it builds on other RPs, other standards, other things that operators do within their own organization. It's to build on those and to provide a framework, a glue that brings them all together. So it's never intended to supersede or push aside. It's intended to bring those best practices, those recommended practices from other places that you're already applying, and apply them in a larger, broader context.
And regarding management of change, probably everyone in this room is very familiar with management of change and what can happen if you don't follow a management of change process. But what we encourage you to do is think about non-traditional changes as well. You need to think about what happens if you change personnel. It's not just about changing pipe or changing procedures. Sometimes it's the things you don't think about that can get you. For example, what if your financial system changes and that cathodic protection, rectifiers, ground bed, all those orders that you expected to be filled, and changes to your pipe you thought you could do in 3 months now takes 12 months. How does that affect the safety of your line? I mean, a simple example, but there are all types of changes that you have to consider.
The last area there is the use of contractors, and we thought this was a place where we would drill down and provide a little bit more detail on the work that we did and really the context that we're trying to create. There's really the expectation that the operator will communicate the requirements of the pipeline safety management system, that they're clearly understood by contractors and service providers, defining responsibility, accountability, and authority for those people in the process, and for those responsible for managing the outsourced process, and then the use of that data and information when it comes back into the day-to-day operations. Incorporating work and findings. And many of these points were actually made in the NTSB report on Enbridge, and they really helped us get a keen focus on the contracting process.
One of the things when you look at contractors, depending on your situation, you may say, well, I use this contractor to provide this specific job or this specific task. And you may not think about them as your employee, but from a regulator perspective, we consider them your employee. So what your contractor does, you do. And so when you look at it that way and you think about those people as employees, the things they do, you need to bring their lessons learned back into your lessons learned, to your company's lessons learned. You need to provide them safety training. You need to communicate to them your expectations of a safety culture and how they should perform. And perhaps you should be monitoring their performance in those areas as well. That it is one large group working on the overall safety of your system, and as a company, you're ultimately responsible for that, no matter who does those functions.
I think a couple of final points on this slide. It's important that you're communicating the risks that are present at a work site, not just through job safety analysis, but the risks that are posed by the work that will be done. In some cases, there's unknowns, and we need to have our contractors understand the unknowns as well. And finally, communicating the MOC procedure and how that's applied, and when there's a need to make a change while work is being conducted, that it's done under that MOC process. Thank you.
Thanks.